Hey everybody, Brandon here, welcome back to a new video. Today we are going to be looking at my 12th tournament game, and this is the start of my 4th tournament. This was a 3-game tournament, however I only played 2 because the second game, this is the first, the second game was won by forfeit because my opponent did not show up. So if you're wondering why this video is the 12th game and the following video will be the 14th, now you know, just in case. I just wanted to get that out of the way. But anyways, I am playing with the white pieces against Anurad, who is rated about 970. The actual rating will be on screen, so you can see it there. Let's just jump into the game now. E4, C5, knight F3, and D6. Now I played D4 here, so that this is the most logical move. The whole point of D4 is after c takes and knight takes, although you gave up a central pawn for a flank pawn, the whole point is that you have a knight on d4 and it's this well-placed piece. It's often quite good on d4 because it covers certain squares that can be very useful later on. Knight to f6, attacking the e4 pawn with development. That's always a good thing to look for if you can attack something and improve your pieces. Knight to c3, developing and defending. a6, and a6 is the najdorf, and I believe this is the first time we're seeing the najdorf. And the whole point of this move is to prevent anything going to b5. As you can see, the bishop on f1 is looking at b5, the knight on d4 is looking at b5, and the knight on c3 is looking at b5. This is often a very important square in these positions, so a6 is a very logical move. Bishop to g5 is the main line after a6, and the whole point of it is that this knight is very well placed and you want to put pressure on it because it does control e4 and d5, which can be critical squares in the Sicilian. e6 and f4. Normally you'd want to play queen f3 here, and this used to be the main line, but many years ago, I think about 3 decades ago, it was found out that this queen f3 is not really that great, and that f4 is needed before queen f3. And if you were interested in the history of why, I'm actually going to link in the description a commentary from Kasparov on one of the matches that I believe it was Russia versus Hungary. I could be wrong, but there was a team match, 2 teams versus each other, and there was preparation with after queen f3 there was issues. But yeah, I'm not going to get too much into the theoretical stuff. If you're interested in that, in the history of that, then link in the description. Alright, I just want to pause just for 1 second, and I want to say that the Kasparov video does not cover queen to f3 first instead of f4. It does cover f4 and then queen to f3. However, it is still a very interesting video, so I will still keep the link in the description. However, that was not actually what I was remembering. I misremembered what was going on. However, the important part of f4 that I'll like to explain now is that f4 covers the e5 square. So there's no knight b to d7 and then knight to e5 in the future. So that's essentially what I should say now. And again, links in the description, and let's continue with the video. But alright, f4. Knight b to d7, which is a little bit of a weirder move order. Normally you'll see bishop to e7. The whole point is you just want to get out of the pin. But knight b to d7, there's nothing really too wrong with it. The computer would rather play queen to e2 instead of queen f3, which is normal. I think the whole point is because maybe e5 could be hanging in the air, you know, like something like queen c7. But alright. Knight b d7 was played, so I just played queen to f3 and then we transpose after bishop to e7 here. I castle long and they castle short. Castling short is interesting here. Normally you'll see queen to c7, which is a lot more natural. The whole point is you're trying to prepare b5, so what could happen here is g4 and b5, and there's no e5. This is important. Not only is there knight d5, but there's bishop to b7, and you attack the queen with tempo, so you're not actually losing your piece. So this is very important to mention. But okay, they castled instead. Bishop to d3. And even before I talk about bishop to d3 and why it's not so great, I would like to mention that the theme of this video is going to be quite obvious after we see where the kings are. my king is on the queen side and their king is on the king side. King side refers to the side where your king originally starts. So this would be the king side, and this is the queen side. And when you see opposite side castling in these positions, normally you want to play on the side that your opponent's king is on. So white's goal is to aim at this king, play moves like g4 and g5, and black's plans are to play things like b5 and b4. Of course, d5 as well is very important. However, here it's also important to think that because you want to play on opposite sides of the board, you don't want to let your opponent attack you faster than you can attack them. So timing is very, very important in these positions. And this is actually why bishop to d3 is not so great. It's not as useful of a move because what white wants to do here is play a move like g4. And this is the common theme in this opening, as now there's plans to possibly take. It might not be so great now, or depending on what black's moves are. But a normal plan is to take and play g5 and sometimes sacrifice the pawn with f5. But I played bishop to d3 instead, it makes a lot of sense. It's like a very natural move. It's not terrible. It's not quite the most accurate. And the whole point is that it is looking at this h7 pawn if we do play e5. So there is some merit to it. And it does actually play into our favor later in the game. Rook to b8, and I think the reason why they played it is because they were scared of b5 and e5. So if b5, e5 here. But instead, what they should have done is likely just queen c7 instead. Queen c7 prepares this b5, and again, after e5, then there's this bishop to b7. So they don't have to really worry there. But alright, okay, so queen to c7, or sorry, rook to b8, and then rook to e1. And this is what I was talking about with time. The rook on d1 is already sufficiently placed. You don't need to move it. If I wanted to improve one of my rooks, it would be the h1 rook. And playing rook h to e1 makes a lot more sense, as now all of my pieces are centralized, and all of my pieces, well, they're just in the game, and they're ready to start actually making more aggressive moves. Because the rook on h1, although it looks like a great piece, because, well, it is looking at this h7 pawn indirectly. Of course, the h2 pawn is in front of it. If it was just gone, then I think it would benefit us. But the thing is, it's not really easy to break through on the king side yet. So this rook h to e1 makes a lot more sense, because if the file ever opens, we can always just swing our rook back. It just takes one move to do. But for now, the rook has a lot more scope on the e file, preparing things like e5 than it would on h1, where it's not doing that. So rook d to e1 is not really in the right direction, because this was the problem rook, or problematic rook, and not this one, if we're going to be looking at improving one of the rooks. So I thought that would be important to mention. Now we see h6, and this is not such a great move from my opponent. Normally, when you are playing opposite sides, you do not want to only push pawns that are in front of your king. You also don't want to play on that side of the board. They're playing these defensive moves. h6 is not in the spirit of this position, because there are specific tactical ideas here that I'll mention in a second. But if anything, it just gives me more help. So let's just say bishop h4, which is what I played in the game. But there's always moves like g4 and g5, and all of a sudden now this h6 pawn is not really well placed, and there's ideas like taking or even pushing. And now there's a weakness. There's something called a hook. Whenever you have a pawn that's not on the same level as the other pawns, you would usually call that a hook, and that's where you want to start attacking with things like g4, g5. However, instead of bishop to h4, there's actually a really interesting move here, and that's h4. If you're familiar with the fishing pole, you might be aware of this, and unfortunately, black cannot take the bishop because it's losing by force after h takes, and you just lose this piece, and after you lose this piece, well, the h file's open, there's too much initiative, black should just be completely lost here. Saying that h7 though, queen to h5, and you already lose the piece. You can't move it anywhere, and we can just take a next move. The only hope is just f5, but this is just a forced mate pretty much. After queen takes, king takes, takes, and then bishop to c4, d5 takes, and checkmate. So unfortunately, yeah, you can't really take on g5 after h4, though it is very circumstantial. You should always calculate the specifics in these types of positions if you're trying to play a move like h4. But in this case, it's actually quite good for white. And after h4, this h6 move doesn't make sense because, again, since they can never take, it's just a wasted move. And now moves like g4 are going to come, and after takes, then g5, and the position's going to be just completely ripped open, and black is strategically much worse here, if not losing. But alright, bishop to h4 instead. e5. e5 is strategically not so great. And the reason why is because the pawn on e6 is doing something very important. It's controlling the f5 square. The f5 square is very important to control here because there's no knight f5. And knight f5, although maybe not tactically doing anything immediately, it's a very scary move to look at, and you do have to worry. So after e5, you're just giving the knight on d4 a square, a better square, closer to your king that it can go to. And again, they're playing on the wrong side of the board. So of course I jump in with knight f5. Now we see b5. And I took on e7. This is okay. However, there was actually just a clear line here with queen g3. The whole point is you're threatening checkmate. g6 is really the only move here. Move like knight to e8 just doesn't really make too much sense because bishop takes e7, and we're just winning an exchange as well. However, g6. Now h6 is hanging. We can take that immediately. But one computer line is just rook h to f1 because, again, they can't take because it's pinned to the king. And bishop b7 and just takes on e5. And they can't take with the knight because, well, there's issues here with knight h6 especially. But this is just clearly much worse, and if not, just losing now for black. So this isn't what happened in the game. Instead, knight takes e7, which is a logical move. You get the bishop pair in open position. Like, I know why I played this, and that's reasonable thought process. Anyway, so after queen takes e7, knight d5, queen d8, all also logical. And then I make a pretty serious mistake here. Normally when you're playing on this side of the board and you can see that my pieces are all aimed toward this king, you want to open the position up towards this king. However, I played f5. f5 is very counterintuitive, and it's not because it's a good thing. It's actually a very bad thing here, and it's very counterintuitive because it's not a good idea. The whole point, I think, was that I'm controlling more space. However, this just closes down the position. If anything, I should be looking again at maybe some queen g3 or even f takes e5, or after knight takes e5, queen g3. And there's no g5 because just bishop takes, and we win back our piece. And with the pawn, this is just winning. However, after queen to g3, luckily knight h5 saves the game for them. However, we're up a pawn after queen takes e5, queen takes h4, and queen takes on d6. If they took back here, this is very miserable for them, so it wouldn't be that great of an option. So they can't really do this because this knight is just really sad, and a move like g3, for example, and if they have to go knight f6, this is just a much better pawn structure, and maybe like a move like rook to f1, and they have no play on this side of the board. We have a target on f6 that we can just continuously attack, and this is just going to be much worse for black for the entire game because this is a static thing that they cannot get rid of. Okay, a little too complex. We're not going to go too much further into that, but f5 objectively just doesn't make sense. That's the theme I want to take away from this. This just kind of wastes time. And it keeps the position closed on the side of the board we want open. So, all right, bishop to b7, normal move, and g4. G4 made sense. It's not so great. Instead, knight takes f6 would be better, where after knight takes f6 and then king b1. White's still playing, and it's about equal in this position. But after g4, bishop takes d5 and e takes d5. It's actually fair to say that black is actually better here now, because this g5 move isn't easy to get in anymore, and that's just because of the move queen to a5, which has threats of a2, and that's what was played in the game. So I played king to b1, knight to h7. Now there's no g5 because knight takes g5. Rook e to g1, trying to just prepare g5 and keep my rook on h1 in case I play any h4s. But rook e to g1, f6, bishop to e1. This is important because I need to reroute to d2 and play h4. So this is why I saw in the game. Queen c7, h4, knight to c5, and bishop to d2. Now we need to look at this position, and I would say maybe a move like knight takes d3 makes a lot of sense here. Objectively, this doesn't look so great for black. They definitely did something wrong the past couple moves. It feels like this g5 is going to be quite fast, and it doesn't feel like there's too much counterplay. So it's still not such a great position for black here. But instead they played e4, which is very illogical because they could have just taken on d3 in the first place. So if they just took on d3, then it would have just been they took one of my bishops. But after bishop takes e4, then they took and queen takes. So they just gave up a pawn, and I'm not really sure what they got out of that, other than an open file that isn't really contributing to the position much anyways. Rook f to e8 and queen to d3, and now white is just much better in this position. So there's not really much that they can do realistically. g5 is still coming, and it's kind of over. So they play queen to c4. It does actually make a lot of sense, because with this move queen to c4, they're saying, okay, you can damage my structure a little bit, but the thing I'll get out of it is that although you'll damage my structure, queens will be off, and maybe you won't be able to checkmate me, which actually is very logical. Queen takes c4, b takes c4 and c3. So when we look at the pawn structure, clearly black's queen side is much worse than mine, and I'm up a pawn. So my goal here is just to target the c4 and e6, d6 pawns mostly, and hopefully they can't get too much activity, but they do manage to get some with this trade. c3, it's also understandable to play like rook e1 first. Even rook to g3 is recommended, because after rook to e2, you just have king to c1, and you just protect the bishop, and there's not really too much. c3 is logical, it's not really in the spirit of the position, because I'm giving them free activity, when in reality I just shouldn't. But alright. B takes c4, c3, rook e2, and bishop c1. Everything's protected. Sure, I'm a little passive, but I'm up a pawn, and things are looking quite good other than those issues. So they played a5, and I was thinking maybe they'd go for like a4, a3. If they were going to play a4, then I'd play a3. I didn't really want to play it yet because it just felt like a waste of a move. So I just played rook to e1 immediately. Rook to g2, which is very good for my opponent because they're trying to keep their pieces on the board and keep activity. However, this rook to e1 move works because I had a move in mind. Rook g1 doesn't really make too much sense. There's rook to h2, of course, I could play h5, but then there's knight g5. So I wanted to keep this knight out of the game, and the way to do this is just playing rook e4. So defending it with this new active piece. Now all of a sudden I do have threats. I'm attacking c4. So rook to c8, and I was trying to find a useful move here, and I realized that probably the best move is just a4, because this pawn can never be attacked, which is true, because no rook can go to b4, and if they can ever get to these squares, then that's very surprising, but it shouldn't happen, at least for a very long time. So clearly white is just winning this endgame now, and it just takes a matter of conversion. So king to f8, and I just played an activating move, bishop to f4. The whole point is that if rook takes g4, then bishop takes d6 with check, and I win the rook. But now, after bishop to f4, the whole point of it is you cannot defend both of these pawns. Either you defend this pawn and you lose this one, or you just hang this d6 pawn. And that's what happened in the game. They played king to f7 and gave up the d6 pawn. Bishop takes d6, rook to e8, rook h to e1. I didn't really want to take when that would just improve their king. So what I did here is rook h to e1, because now their king is still stuck on this side of the board and they can't defend against this pawn running up the board. As we see here, rook takes e4, rook takes e4, and g6. g6, I should have played rook to e7. This is a lot more logical because now their king is forced to the back rank, and then I can take on g6, and well, they have to go here because h7 was hanging. And then I can just take here, and this just makes it so much more difficult for them because, well, there's things like g7, and even pushing this pawn, but this just looks miles better than what happened. But either way, this bishop c5 move that I played is still winning. They take on f5, I take back, and their pieces are still very inactive. The only piece that is active is their rook, but I'm also just up 2 points of material, and it's just not enough to have active counterplay. Rook to d2, so they're attacking the pawn. I played d6 because I had this in mind after rook d5, attacking the c5 bishop. Instead of retreating, I just decided to put my rook on the 7th rank with rook to e7, king to g8, and rook to c7, as all of their pieces are tied down. So this was, I thought, the most important way to play this position, and it's a reasonable way to play it. You can also just play bishop a3, which is very safe as well. There's not really too much wrong with that, but it's quite a reasonable decision to go for this. They played h5 and d7, and they just took on d7 because in reality it's just promoting because I have rook to c8 followed by d8 equals queen. Rook takes d7 and rook takes d7, and now I'm up a full rook and a pawn, and this is just a very easy conversion now. So I'll just show the rest of the game, and here's what happened. King h8, rook a7, king g8, rook takes a5, king g7, rook a7, king to g8, rook to b7, knight to g5, h takes g5, and king h8. The whole point is I think they were going for a stalemate, which I respect it. You know, there's only 2 pawns that can move, and it's not the worst idea. You know, you can always try and never resign, right? That's always a good way to think. a5, f takes g5, a6, king to g8, a7, king h8, and a8 equals queen. And unfortunately, they did not get their stalemate. I ended up winning this game. And if we take away one lesson from this game, I would say play on the side of the board that your opponent's king is on. That's the first thing that I'd mention. But also I would mention, don't waste time in critical positions like this. Wasting time is what will put your opponent in an advantage and give them the opportunities to contribute or improve the plans of whatever they're trying to do. So that's all I'll really say about it, but overall, it was an interesting game, and it was the first Sicilian of many to come. No, it wasn't the first Sicilian, but it was the first of the najdorfs, I believe. I could be wrong. Maybe I am, but I don't think I am. Anyways, this was game 1 of 3 of this tournament, and you will see game number 3 next. As I said before, game number 2 was a forfeit. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.